Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Daniel Kimbro, who I'm sure a load of you will know from his work with the Jerry Douglas Band, also Transatlantic Sessions, Earls of Leicester, and many, many more things. But he's here tonight to talk about a fantastic new solo record he has coming out any day now, which is called Carpet in the Kitchen. Daniel, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be here. I have listened to a few episodes of your podcast, and I really enjoy it.
Oh, well, thank you. I've been listening to your record, and I've been really enjoying that as well.
Sure.
That's fortuitous. It's a great record, and is this your first solo record?
It is, yes. Just kind of one of those things that I don't want to say pieced together because that sounds half-assed, but it's definitely a thing that I've worked on completing in between other obligations, other music obligations that are probably more likely to keep my bills paid than my own first solo endeavor. So, yeah, it is my first effort. And
it's, I mean, you say kind of that piece together. It certainly doesn't sound pieced together. It sounds like a very complete thing. And I've been really enjoying it. Is it, when you sort of talk about having kind of collected this stuff over time and kind of worked on in between things, did it start out as a sort of collection of songs that you had as an album, or have it just been a case of, every time there's a new thing, add it to the list and then get them recorded?
I think it's actually a mixture of both. That's a great question. And I think it's a situation where songs come to you in whatever form they come. Sometimes it's a melody first, or sometimes it's a snippet of lyric first. And sometimes they get rendered and fleshed out, or they reveal themselves to you. And then they are kind of put on the shelf, as it were, and then some of those songs turn out to be similar in tone or theme, or even maybe chord progression. They similar to others in an ongoing collection. You might be in a certain mode or in a certain phase of listening where certain influences are, hitting you more frequently, and I guess these 10-ish songs just sort of ended up becoming a collection that sort of fit well together. And once a few of those kind of gathered their own momentum, maybe some part of your subconscious starts to realize that that's what's happening. And so you start to maybe write or compose things that fit into those other ideas that are already on the proverbial bookshelf. That's certainly true of some of the instrumental things. It's like, oh, I'd like to have a little medley or a segue or something here that would serve as an aural bridge from track whatever to track whatever. And so I think that's a long-winded way to say there were some that I wrote during this composition cycle, as it were, that didn't fit. And those found their way onto other projects or have yet to. But some were written with this album in mind. But I'm not particularly great at that kind of writing. It just kind of whatever happens, happens. And then I was fortunate that a handful of these songs were similar in tone and perspective. They're kind of I sent the record to Andrew Marlin, and he said, "This is cool. Nobody really writes story songs anymore." And that's definitely what these are.
Yeah, it's funny. That's one of the first notes that I made when I started listening to the record, was that it contains lots of story songs, some on a personal level, some more of a kind of social history level, some kind of with a sort of geographical level almost. And I love a story song, the kind of Townes Van Zandt, Steve Earle, Nancy Griffith, those people who can just take you somewhere in 4 minutes and let you see the world through somebody else's eyes.
I think it was always probably going to be that way. At least my first record, I'm always really careful with the slippery slope of pretense, but those names that you just mentioned were always, I say always, frequently on some sort of playback system in my parents' house. My parents are both musical, and my dad writes a lot about fishing, but he's written a fair few songs, and those were the Pillars, the Guy Clark stuff. You mentioned Townes, of course, and Steve Earle, and then even more. You mentioned geography, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention some folks in the very local area to where I live, in R.B. Morris and Malcolm Holcomb, Daryl Scott, Nancy Griffith. These are all people that are really fresh in my mind. Their words are fresh, their chord progressions are fresh, and so I guess it was always going to be that way, especially because my main job, my trade, as it were, is as an accompanist. And you mentioned the Transatlantic sessions, and I think if there is a through line for the folk musics of your part of the world and my part of the world, it's definitely the sense of place is really, really integral to the themes that are presented in musical form. And that's definitely a thing that Appalachians do. It's something that bluegrass musicians do. It's something that folk and old-time musicians do. And it's what I've grown up doing. So I guess it was always going to be that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting, sort of, there's one of the things I was really pleased about when I got the stuff through before the interview was there's a whole bunch of notes that you've written about these tracks, and I love that when somebody gives me a little bit of insight into kind of where their mind was or what the process was, or something I can use as a jumping off point. There's a lovely thing you said about Jerry Douglas, and we're not talking about lyrics here or like any sense of mentioning place, but you said his voice on the resophonic guitar evokes Appalachia. When I hear him, I feel like I know where I am. Yeah. And that's such a, to be able, and that runs through string band music in all its forms, that sense of place, whether it's stylistic or lyrical or whatever. But there's something glorious about music that is attached to a place, but at the same time somehow describes all places, if you know what I mean.
I do know exactly what you mean. I think it's so interesting how familiar a previously unheard bit of instrumental music can be, and how evocative of place something that doesn't have any lyrics can be. And I think, I don't know how necessarily it happens, but I think the best instrumentalists that you and I probably listen to or have listened to, often considering your podcast has the word bluegrass in the title. I think, somehow these instrumental musicians have cultivated an identity that is centered upon a place that you go to when you hear them. And that's, I guess, maybe the ultimate aspiration of anybody who holds an instrument in their hands is to, I don't know how popular Fred Rogers is. Mr. Rogers was a children's show host here in the States. And I once heard him say, an instrument is a country. It's a place. It's somewhere you go to say something. And I think that's really true of songwriting too, but maybe not in the way that one would assume, in the lyrical way, but more in the thematic and tone way. Like, in other words, how do you approach being a lyricist the way that someone like Jerry Douglas approaches being an instrumentalist? And I'll let you know when I figured that out. But that's the goal. That's the goal, And
I don't think many people have figured it out on the level Jerry's figured it out. It's an astonishing thing.
Amen.
And it's really interesting, that sort of sense of kind of telling a story that can be very, very personal, but also resonate with so many people, you know. And sometimes the more detailed things are, the more universal they are. And you sort of counterintuitively think, if I write something really detailed, it's only going to be about me. And those are the things that end up being about everybody, I think.
That's true. I think it's another analog to instrumentalists that are memorable is their use of negative space. If it is use, they're borrowing of it in their phrasing and their own non-lyrical storytelling, because what that allows the listener is for their own theater of the mind to fill in the gaps, whether they realize it is or not. It allows them, maybe it could just be simply described as digestion. It's an opportunity to take a moment in between the ideas that come at you and assimilate them, or at least in some way actually hear them. And I think maybe you could apply the word impressionism if you thought about that lyrically, you know, but you can be too specific, I think sometimes, and you wring all of the good shit out when you are overly specific. But then again, there are people who can so accurately describe something that, you know, their overall art is not in the least bit negatively affected. So I don't know. There's different ways to do it. That's for sure.
It's interesting sort of talking about how the record came together and the idea of themes and thematic material kind of in the kind of content of the song's sense rather than the musical sense. And it's funny, isn't it? I'm not a songwriter, but I've written lots of short fiction, and sometimes it's only when you've written stuff you realize that you have themes. Like as an artist, right. You have subject matter, and you're not sitting there going, I'm going to write another song about this or a song about, you know, but you suddenly find these threads that run through your stuff. And sometimes an album becomes an album because of those, rather than that being the starting point.
Absolutely. I think that's a much better way to say what I was trying to say after your first comment about, you know, where there wasn't intentional that these particular songs were assembled in the way that they are. I was touring in the UK several years ago with my dear friend Martin Harley. We were touring in support of our second duo album together, and we were working our way up to Celtic Connections in Glasgow. And we were interviewed by a gentleman who was doing an article and had taken it upon himself to make a pie chart of all of the through themes of Martin's songwriting across his career, you know, and things like, you know, an analogy to timekeeping, whether a clock or a watch or an alarm clock or whatever, you know, is this many percentage of the sample size, and you use the word so and so this many times and whatever, and it was kind of hilarious and a little bit creepy, but but it was really interesting. On the other hand, to like see it rendered in some sort of like statistical way. How someone's creativity manifested.
It's funny. I remember seeing a very similar thing somebody done about John Irving's novels, and it was like check the box if the novel mentions a bear at some point. Check the box if the novel mentions bingo. Vienna at some point, and you know, and they do, and yet those things aren't really about those things at all. They're sort of starting points and jumping off points. But there are definitely some themes that run through this record. There's some very sort of personal kind of family stuff, particularly Keep On Living, which I think is my favourite song on the record. It's just such a kind of a beautiful story that is your story, but is also, and as you point out in the notes that came with it, like, you know, there's details that you may have embellished or changed, or as you say, bullshitted. And yes. We all do that with our own stories. You know, I am not 100% accurate recounter of any of my own stories, because none of us are.
Absolutely.
But there's also a strong thread of kind of modern day murder ballads on this record as well.
Yeah,
and I find that fascinating, because singing, I don't know, Little Sadie or whatever, that's been around for, you know, many, many, many years, versus actually writing a song in that tradition is a fascinating thing. We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new hill country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, thanks for noticing all of the things that you're noticing. I've done a few podcasts in my effort to promote this work, and I'm just still flabbergasted that anybody is listening to anything that I have written or reading, the descriptions of the songs. And that's great. I have this proclivity for murder ballads, man, and I'm not sure that it's a good thing. Sometimes I don't know. There's a lot of bad shit going on in the world, Matt, and I'm not sure that adding more misery, heartbreak, loss, and despair is necessarily what the world needs. But at the same time, there's a great songwriter called Gretchen Peters, and she had this whole sort of slogan for a while, sad songs make me happy. And that's definitely true. It's like, I need to squeeze the sponge somehow. And I just, like I said, growing up playing the Appalachian musics every weekend, with my parents, like, I guess it was always going to be story songs, and there were always going to be murder ballads, man. It's just the way that it goes, and they are an old thing. It ain't nothing new. So, yeah.
I remember reading the notes, and you said that you played one of the songs on the radio and somebody got in touch to ask if you were okay. And do you get anything? The flip side of that is, I've heard musicians talk about playing murder ballads and getting a bit of stick from people saying like you're kind of promoting violence against women or violence in general, or does that ever sort of rear its head when you play these songs?
It hasn't yet, but it has for peers. It is part of the tradition that I think a lot of us are still trying to wrap our heads around. And I just think that if you don't talk about the really bad things that happen, they're even more likely to occur. Again, the education comes in many forms, I guess. And I'm not taking the stand here or anything. I just think that the number one response I get when I sing a song like Keep On Living or Chesapeake that are on the record, which are definitely both murder ballads, modern ones, as you say, the number one reaction is laughter. And I can't tell if that's from shock or from, oh boy, I wouldn't have said that, which maybe is just another kind of shock. But I also know that they're well-wrought songs, if I may be so braggadocious. But I haven't gotten that kind of pushback quite yet. I think it does happen. It happened. It's a conversation that has happened with all of us in Transatlantic sessions, for example. We've gotten together before, and it's like, okay, this is a song that was sung by slaves. Okay, so here are all these white ass folks up on a stage in Glasgow singing and dancing and having a grand old time and selling the shit out of CDs. Are we doing that on the backs of enslaved people still after all these years? Or are we honoring a tradition and keeping an oral tradition alive? So I don't know what the answers are. I do know that the songs come and I write them down, and I mean no one ill will. So it's a regurgitation of the things that I've listened to my entire life is what it is.
Well, and there's songs in there, like Where I Lay You, and the lyric is the whimsy is too strong a word, but it's a lightly held lyric. And I've talked to Tim O'Brien before, and he said he thinks it's really important sometimes to talk about serious subjects with a light touch.
Absolutely.
And that, you know, because there is an element, I think, with if we want to eradicate the darker side of human behavior, we need to understand it. And sometimes writing, you know, making a film like Dead Man Walking, or writing a song, or writing a book about something really dark is part of the process of trying to work out how it happens.
I don't think it's a coincidence that we are now in an era where a stand-up comedian can sell out a stadium or an amphitheater-sized venue. And it's because of we need salves, we need outlets for the amount of crazy shit that the internet allows us to see on a minute-by-minute basis. And so I think everybody has their own ways of dealing with that stress, and a light touch, a humor touch is required for survival, for me anyway, at this current juncture. So yeah, I
think so. And you know, it's the same with sometimes writing about darkness is processing it for yourself. You know, I just mentioned John Irving, the writer, before. I went in to see him do a Q&A at one point, and I can't remember, I might have talked about this in the podcast before in some form, but somebody said, why do you write so many awful stories about terrible things happening to kids? He said, well, I had little kids, they used to keep me awake at night, terrified what might happen to them, and so I just made up some other kids and made it all happen to them instead, and somehow it helped me sleep, you know.
Yeah, these things manifest into manias if we don't somehow get them out. I really think that's true. I mean, Cormac McCarthy, who lived here in Knoxville for a good while and wrote a novel about it, Suttree. You know, that's another good example of someone who hit the dark stuff.
Yeah, and one of the other sort of themes that sort of sprung out at me from the record is water in all its forms. And, you know, whether it's like Leicester talking about a town kind of abandoned to progress, or talking about River's Daughter and this idea you talk about in the notes of how important it is to get outside and be out. But also, you know, Chesapeake, and there's lots of different kind of water appears in many. And it was something, and this may be me overreaching to kind of make a connection, but you were very involved in the sort of response, raising funds in the response to Hurricane Helene after that happened, a kind of natural disaster that unleashed all sorts of kind of water and other kinds of mayhem on humans. And a song like Lewiston, which is about intentionally unleashing that. And I don't know, and maybe it's just that I know that you were involved with that made me look for a connection. And maybe I'm overreaching there, but it just felt like there's something really deep in all of that.
No, there is Norman McLean, you know, river runs through it. I'm haunted by waters. Running water especially drives me crazy. I can't stand to not be around it. And I think that's partially, again, my place in the world. In Appalachia, we have so many streams. And I talked about, you know, my dad being a fishing person and a bit of a fishing personality now, and a writer about fishing. And it's just, I guess if there are two through lines of my entire life, earliest memories to current, it's going to be musical things and fishing things. And also just the places that are adjacent to bodies of water in East Tennessee. And now my dad has remarried, you know, a decade ago and moved to the Chesapeake Bay area and restarted a different chapter of his fishing life and story. And so I don't know, man, I just, I'm eaten up with the way water flows. I will be on Google Earth when I can't sleep, and I'm just tracing rivers from headwaters to whatever the next confluence is. And when Hurricane Helene happened, it was, you know, feet of rain being dumped onto mountaintops that drain through eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. And I know these places, and I grew up in these places, fishing them and looking for native artifacts along them with my dad when we were very young, and they're just really intimate places to me. And so the Hurricane Helene thing was just a compulsion. It was like to try to raise some funds to help those folks in Appalachia. It felt more like, that feeling you get when you know beyond the shadow of a doubt that you're going to vomit. It's like, oh, this is going to happen. That was how it felt to have to do, to want to do something to raise a little bit of money for folks affected. And the water thing just it eats me alive, and I have to. It works its way in, it just does. And I'm glad that that's true, because that's how I reset. That's how I get away from whatever is pissing me off about my own creativity or lack thereof, or the lack of funds coming in from being a musician for a living or whatever. It's to reset, is to go ground myself by standing in a river and casting a line. That's the reset button for me. That was a good lesson that COVID taught me. I was just so ambitious to try to get as many musical boxes checked as possible. And then suddenly there weren't any to check because of lockdown. And it was just like, it was some advice from my dad. He said, dude, go fishing. And so I did a lot, and I'm really glad. Yeah. So it's definitely a theme. You're not reading into it. It's all over the place. I like to try to be a vehicle for other people, other musicians to learn fishing. The way I found your podcast was my friend Nick Lloyd Luthier made a copy of Edgar Meyer's bass, and my friend Paul Coert plays it, and I went to hang out with Nick just to see how he makes basses and to get to know him a little bit. And he was like, "Man, we should go fishing sometime." And then Paul got in touch with me and said, I've got this fly rod and I have no idea what to do. Can you teach me how to fly fish? And I said, well, I don't know if I could teach you how to fly fish, but I can try to teach you how to fly cast. And so he and my friend Randy Hunt, who is a double bass luthier in Knoxville, and Nick Lloyd and myself all got together on a small private lake in central Tennessee that was more or less equidistant for all of us to get to. And we got together and sort of had a bass hang. And it was great. I love talking about fishing and the mental solace that I find in doing it. And anybody listening to this wants to talk about fishing, I'd just as soon talk about fishing as I would talk about music. So hit me up.
Well, I am slightly better equipped to talk to you about music than I am fishing, but
yeah. Water, man. It's all over the place here too. We have so many rivers and lakes in this part of the world. It's important. Mountains, rivers, and lakes have got to be near those things. Otherwise, I'm going to feel really claustrophobic somehow.
And how does that sort of play out when your job involves you being in a big tin can trundling up and down the highways?
Yeah, no kidding. Well, the first thing that gets packed is I take a fishing rod with me wherever I go. This is the nice thing about them, is that they break down into small pieces, and flies don't take up much space. And so, especially in festival season, we find ourselves in really, really spectacularly beautiful places like Telluride, Colorado, or up in the Northern Appalachians. Green Mountain Bluegrass Roots Festival is in the heart of some of incredible trout fishing country. And I was fortunate to go with some other bluegrass cats out to Ennis, Montana, and fish and raise some money playing bluegrass out there for a company called Cand-Aid. I say a company, I should say a nonprofit called Cand-Aid that gets instruments and outdoor gear in the hands of disadvantaged youths. And, you'd be surprised what you can find beside the parking lot. There are even concert venues that have rivers or lakes, and if I can make it worth it to get 5 minutes of time in on the river, wherever the closest one is, we were playing, I can't remember where we were playing. Maybe it's somewhere in Massachusetts or something with Sarah Giroux last year, and open the Google Maps app, and 5-minute walk away, there's a river, and finished sound check and had an hour and a half before dinner was served. And so next thing I knew, I had a smallmouth bass at my feet, and it was nice. And It's a similar thing to you think about when songs are maybe possibly overwrought with detail, and it leaves the listener with little options to make the story their own. Somehow, if you flip that concept, when you get small in a geographic location, you almost learn more about it than you do if you're trying to take it all in. So if you focus on this 100 yards of river in this town that I've never been to before, I feel like I have a much more deep connection with that place, and I'm going to remember that venue and that gig more so than I might if I just stayed in the concert hall or in the tour bus or at the festival site and didn't venture out and go focus in a small way on a more specific piece of that location.
Yeah, it's a lovely idea. It's the kind of, actually, because there must be so many places where the console looks the same and the hotel looks the same and the airport looks the same and the bus looks the same and the people on the other side of the bus look the same.
It can be that
idea
way.
The idea of places feeling like places rather than just, stops on a map.
It's helpful for me also to have something to talk about besides my music or my output on the night when you go to the merchandise table after a gig or something like that. And the last thing I want to do a lot of times, for so many of us, we're just replaying all of the shoulda, coulda, wouldas of the gig. And then you're stood there at the table. And if I have said something on stage, or Jerry or Sarah or someone has said something on stage that said, yeah, hey, this guy, you're going to find him out there fishing, and someone comes up to me at the merchandise area and says, oh man, next time you're in town, you should really check out so-and-so river or so-and-so put in or whatever. Great. We're off to the races in a conversation that I am just as invested in because I'm not associating it with my id. And so it's a great opportunity to connect with people in a way that is not so tied to the way that I have been making my living my entire adult life. That's not to say that I'm not grateful for the opportunities that being a musician affords, but let's just say that the existential crises come at you. So it's nice to have a different context or a different conversation topic sometimes.
Yeah, and to sort of, we went pretty quickly there.
That's me.
To backtrack slightly and talk kind of about the record on a more practical level, because there's all sorts of things I'm keen to chat about. But you mentioned at the top that you've spent most of your life as an accompanist.
Yeah.
And so when you decide to do a record, what are you looking for in the people you choose to accompany you?
Man, I guess I'm looking for someone who would have an idea that I would have never had, or at least I didn't think I would have had. And when I first encountered Mike Baggetta, who plays electric guitar on the album, he sought me out. He had moved to Knoxville from New York, and I hadn't played a whole lot of atonal music. I hadn't played a lot of unguided improvised music, meaning free improvised music. I studied jazz and I studied classical music. Certainly in the jazz realm and definitely in the bluegrass realm, there are improvisational elements, but there is not a tradition of finding oneself in a performance space with no idea what might happen, or getting a chart from Baggetta and there's a very specific melody line and bass accompaniment part followed by blank staves with a description of evoke this, or whatever. And that was really creatively exciting to me and permission giving to me. And so it occurred to me that flipping that script, as it were, and getting someone like that to accompany pretty traditional songwriting forms, verses and choruses and bridges and melodies that are definitely derived from traditional Scotch-Irish Appalachian sounding things. Having a cat like that would be fresh for lack of a better word. And Mike had introduced me to Jordan Perlson, who plays drums on the record, who definitely had quite a bit of experience accompanying songwriters, but also had a firm stance in the experimental world and improvisational world as well. I just was so excited by the music I heard these two cats make. And I thought, what is their thing going to sound like accompanying folky songwriting, so I think a lot of people have a misconception about free improvised music or post-genre music or even post-tonal music, that it is raw and in its wanton disregard for form, that it is somehow insensitive or less collaborative than tonal music. And I have found that my experiences playing so-called modern music with the most enjoyable experiences I've had doing it have been with supremely empathetic musicians. And I think Mike and Jordan are two of the most empathetic listeners that I have ever encountered. So if I were looking for one thing, that would be it. Do you believe in this song as much as I do? and you get the impression through the stances they take, no, this must be the guitar part. Are they taking that kind of ownership? Or what do you need from me? And different portions of different songs require either a stance taken or a permission given or a complete, what do you need from me? And those two guys just seem to know which thing is needed for which moment. And that's really cool. And then the other guest that's on the album is Jerry. And I don't know of a more empathetic accompanist for a singer-songwriter. And you can certainly look at his album credits and divine that. It's like, oh, wow. Okay. If you can accompany Ray Charles and you can accompany Randy Travis and you can accompany Alison Krauss and Emmylou Harris and Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott, et cetera, ad nauseum, you probably have an idea what to do in the in-between bits that will punctuate a lyric, or what not to do that would punctuate a lyric. And so that was really fun to have him put the final touch of shellac on top of some of the more raw timbres that Mike and Jordan and I were going for. Yeah, that's a long way to answer that question. All of my answers are too long. Sorry, Matt.
No, this is good. If I wanted to short answers, I could just read the notes that came with the record. I'm looking for the long
Fair
answers.
Enough.
and it sort of results in a really cool set of textures, because there's stuff on the record that is pretty straight, folky textures almost. Through to this, there's like almost a mini suite from the Devil's Den interlude and Murder on the Mountain that sort of flow into each other. And yeah, it is still folky, and they're still kind of folk. They sound like folk songs, and there's something about the older I get, the more when I listen to a record, I want to step into a sonic world of some kind. And
me too.
Like live there for 45 minutes. And sometimes that might just be a voice and a guitar, or it might be like, something with space, like Miles Davis's kind of blue. Rock can do it, jazz can do it. I might want to listen to a bit of Ravel or something. I don't know, but there's just something about that kind of acoustic thing with some sort of warmer, more impressionistic textures going on as well. Like Sarah Jarosz does it really well, kind of combining, an octave mandolin and a bass with some slippery guitar. And actually, totally. I read a beautiful quote about Mike Baggetta when I was doing some research for this. The New York Times described him as a guitarist of slippery proficiency. And I thought that was
great.
a beautiful way of describing what he does on these songs, really.
Totally. Yeah. Mike is the kind of cat that Julian Lage and Nels Cline listen to. You know what I'm saying? And that's not hyperbole. That's literal. He's just, his toolkit, it's unbelievable how many different chisels and rasps and files this man has available to him, and how intentional he is with anything, whether it could be the most atonal sounding timbre you've heard, but it's because he sat at home and figured out how he wanted that to sound rendered through a guitar amp. If there's a pedal on his pedal board, it's not, oh, I thought it sounded cool when I pushed the button. He's gone through the thing and figured out what it evokes in him. And yeah, slippery is a cool word. He is just, I don't know. My musical life was changed for the better whenever I started playing with Mike and his creations. And it was really, really gratifying to ask him to play within mine. He's since moved. His wife is a veterinarian, and he now lives in a different college town. But I don't know. I've got to try to figure out a way to get her fired or something, so he'll move back to Knoxville. Yeah, slippery proficiency. There's a fishing analog in there somewhere.
There we go. It all comes back. And that sort of mini suite that I was talking about, it's it's like a microcosm of the record in that it has all those, like, it's got the lyrical themes of water and death, I guess, and social history and personal history, but also that it builds with these lovely textures, and then you get a song essentially just accompanied by the bass.
Yeah.
And like the most minimal thing on the record is in the middle of all that as well.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time thinking about the arc of the sonics of the record. You know, if it's a long play, you know, listening session, what kind of ride does one go on? There are inevitably performance aspects with which the performer is not satisfied. The Murder on the Mountain song is a song that is dear to me, as are all our darlings, but I just wish I had it's the vocal as a voice has no frets. It has no intonation markers apart from your own skill and the repetitions of those pitches that you're trying to replicate. And then the same is pretty true of the double bass, and to do both of those things at the same time, you kind of can get into a snake chasing its tail kind of thing. And it's like, okay, did I play it out of tune or did I sing it out of tune or both? And I think I'm pretty unhappy with the intonation of that song, but I'm pretty happy with the storytelling vibe of that song. And I think given one or the other, I'd always choose the storytelling impact of it. And that's a song about mountaintop removal and the environmental implications thereof. It was, I always knew that I wanted that to try to do a bass and vocal only kind of thing. And I always knew I wanted to set it up with Mike creating an ambient guitar kind of loop thing, bedrock. And then I improvised a bass thing on top of it, which then flowed into the vocal melody of Murder on the Mountain. And then the Devil's Den song is about a Civil War battlefield. And that was a big part of our family history, was just, I think it's a thing in the South anyway, the Southeastern United States, especially, where, well, it's a slippery slope. Speaking of slippery, I think oftentimes the Civil War is overly celebrated here in this place. And I don't doubt that people believed in what they were fighting for, but it's for us in the States, it's pretty recent history, the 1860s, and in the UK, an hour is 100. No, how's it go? In the UK, 100 miles is a long drive. In the United States, 100 years is a long time. Yeah. But anyway, it was studied in our household, and it wasn't deified. It was studied, and the history of it. And again, because these geographic sense of place. And so I had read this book by Michael Shira, I think is how you pronounce his last name. Maybe it's Shara. I don't remember. It's called The Killer Angels, and it's about battle at Gettysburg, and it's a really bloody thing, man. And this, the idea was this is not a fun place to be. This is not a chivalrous thing. This is not a laudable thing. This is terrible. This is awful. And I don't know why something in my musical brain just went, well, this key is similar, and this anger tone thing could somehow, I'm frustrated by the way that these kinds of tragic events are celebrated. And the same, it's just, the whole album is about the sense of progress. And I'm not exactly sure that that's exactly what we're doing when we build dams and when we fight battles, and stuff like that. So for some reason in my mind, there was a medley there.
And that's a really interesting connection kind of between Leicester and kind of Devil's Den, sort of one pile of rock and one man-made pile of rock, and like the effects they have on. And it is that whole thing about, progress is interesting. We have a sort of different war history in my country, and the war that lives large in people's minds is the Second World War.
Yeah, of course.
But there's still that thing of, if you fight for freedom, you don't then get to choose what people do with it. And so much of what comes after probably makes no sense to the people who fought for it, or it's all, you fight so people can, you almost fight for freedom so that people after you can make stupid decisions. That's sort of the point of it, really,
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's a complicated thing.
Yeah, I would shudder to what certain folks who stormed beaches would say about our recent election. But I don't want to get into that too much. I think sometimes I'm overly vocal about where I stand, so I'm going to try to keep my mouth shut for once.
Fair enough. Well, really interesting, just what you were talking about before, about the voice and the bass having no frets. And but you've done some tour. You toured with Jerry as a duo with another instrument that has no. That must be a nightmare.
It can be. It can be. There was a period of time where the Jerry Douglas Band had no frets in it at all, and it was usually fine in the sort of, as it were, bluegrass keys, G, A, C, D. And we would do this Joe Zawinul tune called "A Remark You Made." Weather Report is the band that recorded it, and recorded the sort of eponymous version. And that first E flat major 7 chord, it was always like a fiddle double stop, double bass, and a dobro chord, kind of up the neck. And it's just like, where is it going to be today? But I don't know. It finds its center, and some nights it's really good, and some nights it's not. Usually, Jerry and I, when we play duo together, I feel pretty damn good about our intonation, as long as climatic conditions don't preclude some sort of harmonic catastrophe,
Well, and talking of singing, I think the vocals on this record are one of my favourite things about it.
Oh wow! Thanks.
There's a simplicity. They're very front and center. They're not buried. They're there, and they are pretty dry and in your ear, if that makes sense. No,
it does. That was a conscious decision. The conscious decision, because it was like, okay, I'm not the best vocalist. I'm not the best intonated. I try to practice. I try to get it better, and I like to think it's better now than it used to be. But there's no hiding that, and it would be a disservice, we all are familiar with instant cameras, like like a Polaroid camera, right? And you take that snapshot of what it is right then, and sometimes some people, my grandmother always shook she said, well, it reveals itself faster if you shake the Polaroid, but it's where you are and who you are at the time, and you can't do a damn thing about it once it's recorded. So you might as well get it out there out front so people can understand what it is you're trying to say. And I mean, I have such a love-hate relationship with any of my creativity, but especially with my voice. It's the one thing you can't do anything about, you know. Anytime you go sing into these microphones, these incredible microphones in these studios that you've paid ridiculous amounts of money to stand in, and rightly so, because they have to pay for those microphones, and they do not lie. My friend Joe McMahon, who's the recordist engineer and mixing engineer on the album, he said his thing was, you know, okay, I'm going to go do another vocal take. You know, he'd say once more unto the humilitron, and he goes step into the humilitron, and yeah. So, you know, when it came time to mix the record, we're standing there, and it's just like, yeah, let them have it, you know. And some of the tracks are maybe a wetter vocal. You know, listeners to the podcast, I'm sure, will be familiar with recording technology and have worked on their own stuff. And I am a card-carrying member of the Reverb-aholics Anonymous group. But, you know, there were conscious decisions made. I'm glad that you dinged on that. There's nowhere to hide it. I might as well just admit it. Yep, I sing out of tune, but the words rhyme.
There's something in the delivery that sort of I'm not entirely sure how or why, but reminds me a little bit of the way Tony Rice sings on Church Street Blues. It's very kind of, it's almost offhand. It's not too adorned. It's quite conversational in a way. And there's something really lovely about it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for mentioning our two names in the same paragraph there. I would just say, if it's anything, I was talking to Greg Koch, this great guitar player friend of mine, about this same thing. And I think that's kind of an Appalachian thing too. You know, I am not comparing myself to this person's vocal skill, but if you listen to how Alison Krauss sings and how unaffected that is, if you listen to the way Dolly Parton sings, and it's just like, that is what she sounds like. That is what she sounds like. You listen to the way Edgar plays the bass and how unadorned at times, you know, his playing is, as far as, and I say unadorned, I mean unornamented. There's not a lot of embellishment around the pitch in terms of vibrato, for example. And you hear that in great fiddle playing as well. You know, it can be expressive and emotive without it needing to be oscillatory, if oscillatory is a word.
It
without
is
the pitch oscillating in some way. Yeah, it is now. We've used it on a podcast. You know, so I think it's just, I guess that's conscious, but I don't really think that I can't take too much credit for that. It's just the way we grew up singing around here, you know.
I mean, it works beautifully on this bunch of material, which, like, obviously would, because it's your material. But you know, it's a feature of the record for me. I'm really enjoying it. And so, when is the record out? When are people going to get to hear it?
The first single comes out a week from our recording of this. Today's the 13th of January. The first single comes out on all of your streaming options on the 21st. Is that right? Yes. Monday, the 21st. And then the album will be with me in physical capacity when I tour the UK at the end of this month. I've got 5 gigs of my own. TBD on the last one, which is in Glasgow at Celtic Connections. But then I'm playing in Newcastle, and I am playing in Huddersfield, and I am playing in Bristol and Spa as well. And I'm playing at the UK Americana showcases that are occurring. There's an Americana association that has a UK contingent. And so I'm hoping to earn more work in presenting my stuff there. So that's when the physical copies will be with me. And then we will trickle out more singles set for a hard release in the United States in the middle of March.
Great. And I will get to see you play at Transatlantic Sessions again.
Sweet.
In London.
Are you coming to the London gig then?
Yeah, I come every year. It's one of the highlights of the year for me.
Thanks. Yeah. I hope I get to say the London gig is always like really hectic to get, because everybody flies home the next day, and it's always packing everything up, and there's curfews and getting out of the city center and avoiding different les fees and whatever else for the tour bus and stuff like that. So But yeah, I hope we get to shake and howdy for a minute.
That'd be cool. Well, congratulations on the record. It's fabulous.
Thanks, Matt. Thank you, man. It means a lot.
I'm a big fan, and I will say I'm a huge fan of Transatlantic Sessions, so we could have talked for an hour about
dude.
that as well.
Yeah, well, another time perhaps. That'd be great.
Oh, it's so nice to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Matt. Appreciate you.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.